and welcome to the Belonging Project podcast, where we explore what it truly means to feel at home in ourselves, our communities, and our work. So, have you ever had that nagging feeling that you don't belong, that somehow, despite all your achievements, you're just waiting for someone to call you a fraud? If so, you're not alone. And what we often call imposter syndrome is something that so many of us experience. Yet, what if we told you that it's not actually a syndrome at all? Today, we are reframing this conversation, and my guest, Leila Ainge, is here to help us rethink about imposter syndrome as imposter phenomenon. I love the term. And we're going to explore why this shift matters, how imposter feelings intersect with belonging, and more importantly, how we can move from self-doubt to self-acceptance. Hi, Leila. I'm so happy to have you here today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I would love to start with a few words about you, if that's okay. Would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about you and your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a psychologist and my research centres around women entrepreneurs. That got me looking into how women work in communities, and I looked at imposter phenomenon and the idea that women didn't feel that they belonged or were frauds, all of the usual stuff that sat there. I also have a career as a management consultant. I do a lot of project management, and I'm currently doing my PhD.
Wow, I love this. So it sounds like you're at the intersection of, very important projects and work for you. I love that.
Thank you. Yeah, very busy, I think is the way I would describe it. But certainly there's definitely a curve and a theme to where my work's going. Having worked around lots of other business owners and entrepreneurs during the COVID years, I think that's what kind of piqued my interest in this whole idea of community, belonging and imposter. So that's really where my research sits and where it's going.
Absolutely. And you have a podcast as well.
I do, yes. I have a podcast called Psychologically Speaking, and I did that because when you do research as a psychologist in an academia kind of world, the expectation is that you publish research into a journal, and a lot of the women who'd taken part in my research, they're not reading academic journals, they're listening to podcasts, and I just wanted to make all of that research accessible, and they'd been part of that journey, so I recorded it into a podcast. And then once I did the first podcast, I kept getting questions from people saying, "You're going to do another?" So I started another season, and this season I'm just exploring lots of different things. So we've been looking at productivity, body doubling, coaching, all sorts of stuff. But it's a joy. I really enjoy kind of delving into that psychological reason why we behave in the way that we do in our work environments, whether that's a traditional office or an online community.
Absolutely. And I love your podcast. As you know, I'm one of your listeners, and I really appreciate how you're, putting all your research into very accessible, short type of format, information. That's really, well, I guess it's how I learn, how I digest things, how I reflect. And so it's been very helpful for me, and it's very down to earth. I very enjoy your style. And that's, where I've actually heard for the first time the term imposter phenomenon. You did an episode fully on this, and I very much enjoyed it. And when at the end of it, I was very much, okay, I really want to carry on and explore further with Leila. So I have to invite her onto the Belonging Project podcast. So here we are today.
We are. It's really interesting because I was quite curious that people didn't know the phrase imposter phenomenon. I think I've always known it as imposter phenomenon. because in the literature and in academic circles, that's what it was called. When it was initially researched, it was a phenomenon that women who were at the top of their game in the 1970s were sitting in front of a couple of psychologists and going, but I feel like a fraud, or I don't see the success I actually have achieved. And that's why it was called a phenomenon. I think over the last 20 or 30 years, it's been a product of its own success in that syndromes really stuck. But the thing that really irks me about that is that syndrome means that it's something that's wrong with us, rather than phenomenon's a much more contextual approach to it. And it's more accurate because actually it's not just about the woman or the man. There's a whole host of things happening there. So I really like that phenomenon title, and I'm urging everybody to use it because it just feels a little bit more inclusive. And I think it makes us curious about how we can start to deal with those feelings and cope with those fraudulent things that happen to us.
Absolutely. You're completely spot on. The word syndrome just gives it a clinical or medical type of feeling or background. It's like there's something to be cured, right? What have you noticed in this language shift that you've been using in your work? How does it help?
I think it helps because when you use imposter syndrome, it's all about how do you combat imposter syndrome? What can you do? What should you be doing? How do you improve yourself? And there's some really interesting research out there at the moment, which really talks about how women are sold more self-help tropes than men. We're told we need to improve more than men. And from a feminist perspective, part of me just wanted to push back on that and go, it can't all be about the woman, right? So as I've explored this and started to move away from the syndrome, what it's actually enabled us to do in coaching sessions is to say, tell me what your work context is like. What is work like for you? Almost taking that individual to sit as an observer to their workspace and say, how does it look and feel? What's going on? What's the culture? And then you start to get to the heart of community and belonging, because it isn't just about the individual, it's about what they're experiencing there. So I think it's a really subtle shift, but it's so performative in terms of that coaching relationship. And what I wanted to do with imposter phenomenon research was to give coaches different ways and tools to explore fraudulent feelings with women, especially, that didn't result in women feeling that they had to fix themselves. I'd rather they go and challenge something that's not working for them and say, actually, I need positive feedback more often, or actually it would be great if I felt that I could put my hand up and make suggestions because I don't feel that at the moment. When we can shift to being able to say what's wrong, I think that helps more.
Absolutely. And I've heard you mention, women and men.
Yes.
What's the research telling us? Are there differences between men and women in how they approach the imposter phenomenon?
I think that the literature is really difficult to detangle around this for a number of reasons. One, imposter phenomenon or syndrome has been researched in lots of different ways. So there's a couple of main scales that are used. The Clance and Imes scales, the two psychologists that came up with it, have a particular type of scale, and it was developed based on their initial research. So it tends to ask the same type of questions around the individual. I think that has been used in many different settings. It's been used with men and with women, but things that we don't really know, for example, is truly how many people experience imposter. And notice I'm saying experience rather than suffer from, and there's that language around it's something we experience it as a collective rather than it being something wrong with me. We don't also know whether the current construct of imposter and the ways we might ask the questions, are they developed enough to look at the modern world of work, for example? So are they asking questions about me that were based on questions 20, 30 years ago? So the really interesting thing is that we have these scales. They're used quite generously in psychology. There was a really good review a few years ago that said actually they're all measuring slightly different things, and that's unhelpful from a scientific perspective. So I think there's some work to be done there. In terms of men and women, and do they experience this phenomenon in different ways? I think absolutely they must do, because if you look at the world of work, men and women experience things differently because of things like patriarchy, capitalism, feminism, inequity, stereotypes, all of that stuff. But that doesn't mean that men don't experience imposter phenomenon. I think what I'm hearing through feedback on the podcast and my research is that men are saying, I can relate. I can 100% relate to that. And actually, there's a toxic positivity around male leadership that men perhaps, that's a context that they have to live with that women aren't living with. So perhaps they feel they have to uphold systems and structures they're not quite fully behind because that's the way it's expected. So it's a really interesting pot to kind of go and stir. I think what I wanted to do with this research is to say, I think it's time we move that research on. I think it's time we start looking at the construct, time we started looking at what we're calling it and what we're actually measuring. Are we measuring the right things?
Absolutely. What do you think we should be measuring? What would be helpful to measure?
So I think we need to bring in some organisational measures, especially if we're going to use imposter for places like nursing and teaching. So if you look at the research, it's been used in nursing and teaching a lot. So teachers feeling like imposters and nurses that feel like imposters. And it's intriguing because I think if we then started to say, what if those questionnaires included questions about the work environment, not just the individual, I wonder what kind of answers we'd get. So I'd really like to see the research head in that direction.
That would be quite interesting to see. Yes. Yes. And just coming back on something you've mentioned there around the vocabulary that we use to describe our experience. I guess first off, I very much resonate with this, describing our experience, right?
Yes.
So the word experience, I think, is key. It does perhaps... It does tell us that any of us, well, at least that's what I feel. It's an experience that any of us can actually have at some point. This being said, I'm curious to see if you've come across anything in your work or research that is telling us that at some point in our life or career, we are more prone to experience imposter feelings.
Yeah, so I think if we look at the people that I spoke to, who were mostly women who'd had a business for maybe 7 years or more, so they weren't new entrepreneurs or business owners, women who were on average in their 30s and 40s, had children, had a university education. So by all intents and purposes, these are professional women who were well established, well educated, and have families. It was interesting that experience of imposter often increased as they got older, that it came in waves, and some of the wonderful language women used when they spoke to me in the research interviews, used energetic language like whoosh and waterfall and waves. And it really speaks to this idea that the experience of imposter phenomenon, a bit like stress, comes and goes and it can build up. So perhaps there's a difference between fleeting moments, what we would call a state of anxiety or imposter phenomenon, versus our psychological need for belonging, if you like. So really, I think the interesting link here is if you think about sociology, we have this idea of social capital. And social capital is this idea that by being connected to people, we get opportunities, or we can benefit from opportunities. So Putnam, who put that together, came up with bridging and bonding ties. So your bridging ties are the things like between me and you, for example, we have connected through a network. So we're not exactly in the same work environment, but we've connected. So we've got that bridging tie. And then you could say after today, we've got a bonding tie because we've deepened our relationship by getting to know each other a little bit more. The interesting thing is that has been recharacterized as what we call an intrinsic belonging as the bridging, and an external belonging as the external. And this idea that we might have a need to belong to certain groups and categorize ourselves as an entrepreneur or a professional or a scientist or a doctor or a teacher, but we also then have fleeting experiences and periods of time where we more or less feel like we belong with groups. Motherhood is absolutely one of those, and I think quite stereotypically for women, we go through these quite major life transitions where you're suddenly perhaps 9-to-5 worker, or you own your own business, and then you're thrust into neonatal classes, baby classes, dropping a child off at school. And this happens for any caregiver, that we've got women and men who are going through caring for their parents, this sandwich generation. So I think these life events, it might take some of that stability of our belongingness and our communities and connections, and it changes it quite significantly. So I think that's where my interest in networks and entrepreneurs really kind of came from, because I was noticing that people gravitate towards communities, and especially during COVID, we saw that people didn't have that physical touch. They moved into online spaces. They wanted to emulate that and create it. But I also know that a lot of people don't always feel 100% connected to the communities they do self-select to be in. And why is that? Where does that belongingness come from? And I think a lot of this then, we can start to explain some of that behaviour through some of the things that happen with imposter phenomenon. Why do we feel like a fraud? Why do we feel like we don't belong? What's the context? How safe do we feel in that space?
Absolutely. And would you say that there could be some groups, some identities that would tend to experience more of those fleeting moments of imposter feelings?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think the standout article for me for imposter when I was doing my research wasn't an academic article. It was an article on HBR, and it was called "Stop Telling Women They've Got Imposter Syndrome." And it was really written from the perspective of marginalised voices and Black women in business, and how actually when we say that the woman has a problem, we're starting to ignore some systemic issues around inequity. So we do know that women as a marginalised group, or a group that is treated in unequal ways. We know that Black women who are migrants, women who probably come from families where they've moved into professional careers from maybe working class backgrounds. There are lots of different layers there that we could probably say. We think that there are people who might experience imposter phenomenon more deeply than others because of the shifts in context that they're moving from and to. So I think it's quite curious. And again, when I'm saying that we need to ask questions of organisations and context when we're asking people about imposter with scales, that's something else to bring into the mix, isn't it? There's been some really interesting research around young Black boys in schools and their experience of imposter phenomenon. So I think we're starting to see more research around, different marginalised groups and stereotypical ways in which we've always looked at imposter.
That's very interesting. And perhaps here thinking about the language that may be used in schools, but also in organizations, raising stars, rock stars,
yes,
right? So those would be words that perhaps would be given as a positive reinforcement in some schools. And then in some organization, you would you would hear the word expert everywhere, or born leader, those type of words that are coming up. Would they also lead to feeling like an imposter if we don't resonate with those words, or if we don't match the definition?
I think absolutely. It's a really good example. And if you think about culture and your own values, so individually we all rock up into the world with our own values that come from, you know, our own experiences as children and into adulthood. You might join an organisation, spend a lot of time there, and then maybe you move to another job. And I think that's when people most notice company culture the most, is when they move from their first job to their second job. And that comes up in coaching sessions with my clients quite a lot when we're doing career transitions. I think cultural values can be really interesting in helping us understand what we perceive ourselves as and not. So it highlights what we're comfortable with, what we're not comfortable with, what feels that sense of we-ness. So in terms of social identity theory, which is a psychological theory, that is the idea that we've got our own personality, but we also have this social identity that's linked to the group we're in. And we're not just in one group, we're in many groups. So you're in a work group, you're in your friendship groups, and you might be in a sports group. But when you're in that group, you think of yourself as we, not I. And that sense of we-ness comes from feeling that you're aligned with the values of the group. If you don't feel very aligned with the values of the group and some of the language that's used, it can be really uncomfortable, and it can cause discomfort to people. I think I've experienced that. I've worked with lots of different companies and been a consultant for many years and done a lot of project work. And there are some companies you go and you think, yeah, this is my vibe. I feel like I gel with this team. There'll be other companies where I'm like, okay, I can do the job, but these are not my people. I don't feel I'm not part of the we here. I feel like me coming in to do a job. And I think people are very aware of that. I think people sense that when they're moving between different social spaces, and sometimes it takes time to feel like you're a member of a group. There's initiation and stuff that happens, but you can also be a member of a group one day and then not feel like a member of a group the next day. So this difference between, you know, that human trait of belongingness, that we have the need for belongingness, is quite kind of level throughout our lives. But that state belonging, that can change. Say if you, for example, you suffer a bereavement and it massively impacts your worldview, maybe it was a parent or something, then it may be that for a while you actually feel a bit disconnected from your friendship group if they've not been through what you've been through. So there are loads of little things there that I think that we can start to unpick and say, yes, that would explain why some language in organisations or in some spaces or some communities, I just kind of go, oh God, that's not me, or oh wow, yes, they're speaking my language.
Yes, absolutely. And you've touched on cultural values and the impact culture can have on this as well. Would you say that, do you see that some cultures normalize imposter feelings or even self-doubt more generally, more than others?
Yes, definitely. So one of the really interesting things that happened with the imposter phenomenon research is women were describing to me how they used language to navigate really complex social spaces online. So in the online space during lockdown, loads of communities popped up and they were all using different languages to describe themselves. So you'd have some that would like use terminology like girl boss, and others would be much more reserved, lots of different language. And depending on how you feel about certain types of language, it would probably dictate whether you joined that group or wanted to join that group. Also then in those individual groups have their own norms and values. So some groups might just really encourage people to put everything out there and have a venting space and to say, yes, well, you know, you can be really vulnerable here. It's a safe space and people might do that. You might have other spaces where that that just isn't encouraged, or whether people put on a professional veneer, or perhaps it's a space where there is a lack of psychological safety, and people are just quite reserved. So I think a lot of that plays into it as well.
Absolutely. Yes. And it's interesting how, I guess here again we go back to how the language matters, how much language matters, how much it could actually have a correlation to, do we belong? What's making us feel that we belong? I feel often, at least for me, it goes back to, do I feel that there is alignment in some of my core values? I'm not expecting all of them to be aligned. I think that probably would be, I don't know, unrealistic, but at least to a certain extent, there is alignment. And this can change as well, going back to what you were saying.
It's really interesting. I think the studies start to show, when we look at social identity studies, they start to show that it's not just being in a group and taking part and being a joiner in that makes you feel like you belong. And that's really interesting, isn't it? Because it feels counterintuitive. I feel like we're told from a very young age, be a joiner in, take part, do your best. And we're told that fosters belonging and community. Actually, some of the more recent research shows that a sense of belongingness needs to exist to feel that you're part of a community. And you could turn up to every single event that a community puts on, or every single Zoom call, and still not feel like you belong there. So we know that belongingness is almost separate to that. I suppose what makes it really challenging from a psychological perspective is that there's no real consensus on how to measure belonging. And I'm sure you've come across this in all of your conversations with various guests. There are loads of different ways to conceptualize belonging. Whether you're a psychologist, a sociologist, or a business person, you've got your own frame of reference for what you mean by belonging. And we seem to be measuring lots of different things. And are we measuring the trait or the state is a really good place to start there as well, because state belonging changes so much and so frequently.
Yeah. All right, I have a question. Switching gears a little bit. Are there any benefits of feeling this imposter phenomenon?
Yes, I think absolutely. So if we then start to say, this isn't just about you, actually, there might be something else going on there, I think that allows us to be curious about, well, if I'm feeling this way, others might be feeling that way. And it's always worth speaking up and perhaps challenging the status quo. And so if you think about that language you're talking about, if there is language that we're not comfortable with, there's really easy ways to subvert language use is by introducing new words and phrases or calling it out. So I think the helpful thing about recognizing imposter phenomenon in the first place is just to, I want to empower people to say, right, feel empowered to recognize it, but not to blame yourself. See what else can be changed or tweaked and moved. And I think that's a really positive thing that can come out of imposter phenomenon.
So if we start thinking about challenging the status quo, thinking about what we can tweak, there is an element of transforming that imposter experience into growth, right?
Definitely. And then if you look at the other things that imposter phenomenon can do for us in terms of a benefit of getting to know ourselves, and I think you talked right at the beginning around self-acceptance. One of the interesting themes in my research was this quote that came up, and one of my participants just said, I miss her, I miss me, and they were talking about themselves. When I started doing imposter research, I expected comparison to be very central to all of the conversations. This idea that women might compare themselves against other women really often and frequently. As it happens, they are comparing themselves against other women, but mostly themselves, a younger version of themselves, or perhaps even an idealised version of who they should be. So I think when we can start to recognise those imposter phenomenon experiences, I think it's a good phrasing or tool set in coaching sessions to be able to say, let's bring us into the here and now. Who are you right now? Let's forget the past. Let's pause the future, but who are you right here, right now? What do you need right here and right now? And what is this space giving you or not giving you? So I think that's a powerful question and a point of curiosity that phenomenons of feeling like a fraud can give us. And again, it's just flipping that narrative, isn't it? And how different that feels to, oh God, I've got to work on my confidence. I mean, that's really difficult to do. What do we mean by that?
Absolutely. And it's often a container for actually something that might be deeper, or if we're able to crack open that container, right? We're able to bring some light in and see it in a different way, and perhaps in a way that we're able to verbalize more, or to give more resonating examples, and get in a place of, okay, I actually can challenge this. I have the means to do so, and I will do it, right?
Totally. I've really enjoyed researching imposter phenomena. I think one of the things that I've enjoyed the most is the idea that we've come out of the research that happened with women over lockdown with a better understanding of what that phenomenon means contextually, and that we can just ask different questions so that we're not prescribing solutions that actually feel like sticky plasters over a bigger problem. And that, for me, feels like what psychology should be doing anyway. You know, what's the societal benefit for us blaming women for something versus the societal benefit for saying, God, this doesn't work for lots of groups of people, and actually it's even worse if you're marginalised or, you know, from a minority group or whatever. So that really drove me forward. It continues to drive me forward in all of my research. Is, you know, why I'm here.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate you sharing the insights that you got out of the research, but also about your own drives into this topic. So we see how having coaching conversations or conversation and dialogue about how you're feeling, how is this imposter experience coming up for you. But when we are alone, sitting on our, by ourselves with those feelings, what would you say is a helpful tool, accessible enough to get us out of that space and into a more productive, self-accepting space?
Yes, I think some of it is around language, maybe around asking ourselves some questions. And there's this thing around when we're trying to achieve goals that if we use I statements, they're not as helpful as you statements. So if I'm to say to myself, I can do this versus you can do this, from a coaching perspective, we know that in sports, the you statements work really well. So what you might do if you're having those kind of consistent thoughts in your head, and this is something that's quite prevalent with imposter phenomenon, is those cyclic thoughts of self-doubt. One way to kind of move out of that would be to ask yourself a you statement, to say, what do you need right now, Leila? Or what do you need? And use your own name. What do you need, rather than what do I need to change? And it's just a simple reframe there. But I think when you say, what do you need, it leads to the, well, what have I not got right now? And you might fall back into that kind of triangle of core needs that Maslow's talking about. If you've got food, warmth, safety, that kind of stuff, maybe there's something quite obvious lacking. I think the other thing that happens with imposter phenomenon is, we talked about that energetic whoosh of feelings, that waterfall that people call imposter, and it can really come on like a wave. When we're experiencing an emotion quite strongly, and we're in that state emotion of feeling it, it can be quite hard to unpack, what am I feeling and why, and where did that come from? So again, just sitting back and going, what do you need right now? It's such an anxiety dampening question to ask yourself, and such a simple one. You don't have to have the answers. It's just a probing thing to do.
And I think that question can sometimes feel like a hug. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
giving us that moment of, okay, heart to heart with myself, right? What do I need? Grounding, quite grounding, and very much bringing everything back to basics, perhaps in a moment where we might feel a little bit too much in our head, bringing it back to our heart.
Definitely. I think when I wrote up my research, I was encouraged to write some practitioner points at the start of it. So what can people take away from this research? And I said, well, actually, it's a set of coaching questions here that moves us from our high emotional state into reducing that emotion and the feeling and decentering it from us and moving it out and being curious. And we know that's a really good thing for us to do in a coaching space. So I was quite excited to share that, and the evidence really comes from those conversations because, you know, the women I spoke to had the solutions. For every woman I spoke to who said, yes, I've experienced this, they also were able to tell me, and how I cope with this is by doing X, Y, and Z. And actually, they'd been able to use some of these techniques. When we talked about it in the conversation, they were reflecting on it and going, oh, actually, when I do that, it's not as bad. And it was almost like they were realizing for the first time that they have learned to cope with that feeling of imposter phenomenon.
And that is such a great moment to capture, right? Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Leila, for sharing all those insights. It's been a pleasure to deep dive into this and to explore this other side of the imposter, right? It doesn't have to be negative. It doesn't have to be dragging us down. What are we learning out of being in that moment, sitting with that imposter phenomenon? Thank you so much, Leila. Really enjoyed our chat.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
You can follow the podcast on LinkedIn at the Belonging Project Podcast. You can also hit subscribe and stay up to date with our episodes. And do feel free to get in touch with me on coaching@fiorenzarossini.com. Thank you again and see you next time.